So we will start. I remind you, good morning to everybody in different parts of the world. This is part of the cycle of conferences of the Center for Chinese Mexican Studies at the School of Economics at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. The cycle of conferences exists since 2005. We have 300 and plus conferences, and we have a good stock of PowerPoints, videos, audios of these historical conferences. If you wish, I remind everybody that we will have a very interesting cycle of conferences in the next weeks, no? And you will receive the information by email in the next weeks, including Osvaldo Rosales, who was the head of ECLAC or CEPAL regarding China and Latin America, but also Isabella Weber from the University of Massachusetts and Amherst, among others. No? Today we are very happy to after a long dialogue with AidData, we are very happy to have two persons that will make an interesting introduction to this data bank. This might be of interest not only for scholars and students, but also for other analysts interested in China. We all know how difficult it is to work with Chinese data. As you know, we are doing our efforts also in order to register China's outward foreign direct investment and also Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to understand the details of this China Development Finance Program team and the work that AidData is doing, and also specifically to understand the details of the data set that AidData is providing. No? We have two great presenters. On the one hand, we have AMMAR MALIK, who is the executive director of AidData. AidData is at the College of William and Mary, and he has a PhD in international relations at the London School of Economics, and lots of publications related to development, among other issues. No? And the second presentation together as a team will be by Catherine Walsh. She's the program manager at AidData and also part of the team of Chinese Development Finance Program, and she has a BA at the William and Mary College. No? So again, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your wisdom and for socializing this so that we might have access and understand the details. No? I remind you, usually we have presentations of around 30 to 45 minutes, and we allow for a time for questions and answers by the chat. No? So welcome, AMMAR and Catherine, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Enrique. And on behalf of AidData, I would like to thank you for inviting us today. My colleague Catherine will get us started, and I will then step in a little bit later. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you very much. So as you may be aware, we released our a new version of our data set, the Chinese Global Development Finance 2.0 data set last September. And we released also an accompanying report called Banking on the Belt and Road, Insights from a New Global Data Set of 13,427 Chinese development projects. And thank you for the kind introduction, Enrique. I'll be presenting with AMMAR, who is a senior research scientist with us at AidData. So to give you just a quick introduction to AidData itself, the organization that we work with, we have a staff of about 35 individuals, including program evaluators, policy analysts, and media and communication professionals who all work with governments and international organizations with us to improve the ways in which overseas investments are targeted, monitored, and evaluated. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see listed here some of the organizations that we work with. On our Chinese development finance work specifically, our major partners, our funders are USAID from the US government, the Hewlett Foundation, and some other funders interested in helping us to collect that data on Chinese development finance. We're a research lab based at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. AidData was established there in 2004, and really our work portfolio has very much expanded since then. At AidData, we have expertise in tracking underreported financial flows, including Chinese development finance, as well as expertise on geospatial analysis, causal inference, and survey methods. So taking a closer look at the data set now, sort of the purpose and scope of the work that we do. The work that we do is really meant to facilitate rigorous analysis and support evidence-based decision-making by providing comprehensive, reliable, granular data on China's overseas development finance program. We're very unbiased in the approach that we take on collecting this data so that it can be used after we make it publicly available by whoever may benefit from using this type of data. The scope of the work that we just released last September includes all official sector financial flows from China that align with the OECD's criteria for ODA and OOF, which would be financing from official sector institutions from China. This includes grants, technical assistance, loans, export buyers credits, suppliers credits, debt forgiveness, and rescheduling, all different types of flows that you can imagine that are financed by official institutions from China. The data set that we released includes 13,427 projects. So this would be over 13,000 rows of data, each of which captures a project level flow. So financing from China for a specific project in a recipient country. And the value of this financing that we captured for the 2000 to 2017 commitment year period is $843 billion across 165 countries in every major world region. The data set includes 70 variables, very comprehensive coverage of all different kinds of sectors, various income groups, including all low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income countries receiving Chinese financing, as well as all different types of official sector institutions from China, including state-owned enterprises as well that are financing projects in these countries. This also includes over 5,000 borrowing and recipient and implementing institutions that we track in the data related to each of these project level entries. And all of these have been categorized, all of these organizations we've allocated to a category of government agency, state-owned enterprise, special purpose vehicle, or joint venture company, a state-owned bank, private sector institution. And we've also assigned the country of origin for each of these organizations involved in these Chinese finance projects. The 70 variables that we include, as you can imagine, very extensive. They include variables related to the financial commitment year. This is when an official financing agreement was signed between the two parties for this specific project, as well as the amount and the original currency of denomination for those projects. So whenever we can identify a loan that was contracted in Chinese renminbi yuan for a project, we'll very clearly specify that in the way that we classify the project. It includes also for loans, the interest rate, the maturity length, grace period, associated fees, the use and nature of collateralization for this project financing, and the provision of third-party repayment guarantees as well as assigning the identity of the guarantor. So in many cases, this would be the government of the recipient country that's providing a guarantee for the loan financing. We also identify when credit insurance has been provided. A major organization involved there would be Sinosure from China. And also we assign the level of financial concessionality based on OECD standards and the way that they calculate this. In terms of concessionality, we're capturing financing with any level of concessionality. This could be as low as 0% based on the terms of the financing. This would be calculated whenever we can identify the interest rate as well as the maturity for the financing. Preferably, we would also include the grant element or the grace period to calculate the concessionality. Whenever the grace period's not known, we kind of assume that it's 0 if it's not specified, but if we otherwise know the interest rate and the maturity. And any value with any project with a grant element above 25% will be considered concessional, and below 25% would be considered non-concessional for the purposes of our classification here based on the OECD standards. And we also assign the 3-digit OECD sector codes so that our data can be easily compared with data available on other donor countries via the OECD creditor reporting system. In a more visual way, you can see here the scope of the data, the vast number of projects that we've captured. We have detailed project descriptions that in this data set has enough words to fill 19 books, full-length novels. We really, put in as much detail as we can regarding the nature of the project that's being financed, as well as the mechanisms involved for the project financing. It took us a long time to put this together. This included about 10 staff members and 130 student researchers. We work with many university students to put together this data throughout the years. And you can see here that there's quite a lot of Chinese financing in Latin America specifically. When just looking at the top 5 recipient countries, you can see Venezuela and Brazil rank very high there for the 2000 to 2017 commitment year period that this covers. So taking a bit of a closer look at how we assembled this data set with our methodology known as tracking underreported financial flows, or the TOUGH methodology, and the most recent version being the 2.0 version of the methodology. For a flow to be included, it would be any transaction that meets the OECD's criteria for official financing, which would be classified as either ODA or OOF. In cases where we don't have enough information to make the determination on whether or not a project would be classified as ODA or OOF, typically related to loans, if we don't have enough information to determine the concessionality, we'll assign it to a vague official finance category. The data set that we put together is primarily based on official sources, which would include sources like unredacted loan and export credit agreements that we find published in government registers and gazettes. And then we also perform supplemental data collection from unofficial sources to make sure that we're not missing out on any flows or other sorts of information related to project implementation. These would include sources like media outlets, NGOs or research institutions that may provide additional information on Chinese financing to these 165 recipient countries. In practice, this leads to a data set that's based on 91,000 sources and counting, with the average project record being based on close to 7 sources currently. For more complex projects, you'll typically find them that they're verified by, close to 40 or 50 sources in some cases in our data set. And then the simpler transactions may have less sources, like maybe 3. 89% of the project records that are included in our data set are underpinned by at least one official source. We've been able to verify it with official records from either the Chinese government, the recipient government, or some other organization that's closely involved in project implementation, such as the project contractor. You can find more information on our methodology. We're very transparent about the way that we assemble this data set and include as much information as possible related to the sources that underpin every project entry and the actual procedure that we go through to collect this data. And this would be available at our website and at china.aiddata.org. We also we include stable hyperlinks to official documentation for all of these financial transactions, including information or documentation on like the letter of intent, the term sheet, commercial contract, the actual loan agreement, any debt rescheduling agreements that may come up. Anything related to the project financing, we'll find whatever information is available and clearly document that on the project. And we'll capture, as I mentioned previously, the financial commitment amounts captured in the original currency of denomination and convert them to the same base year USD value for comparison across the years. This is just an image here of the type of documentation you might find on each of these project entries. In this case, a preferential buyer credit loan agreement here. I also wanted to take a moment to show you a different page where you can visualize our data. Just a moment while I see how to change which screen I'm sharing. I think I might stop share and then reshare. Sorry about that. So at china.aiddata.org, you can actually visualize these project entries. I've opened it up here to one project in Latin America that I worked closely on, specifically in Costa Rica. And you can see here that this is quite a large loan that China provided to finance a road project in Costa Rica, the Route 32 renovation project. And one of the data points that we have is related to the geolocation of the project. And you can see kind of in this website that we've visualized here that this is the location of this project that's being financed by this loan from China. We have a separate project entry where we mentioned here the link to another project which captures beyond this government concessional loan for the project. There was also provided an export buyer's credit loan to finance the same renovation of Route 32. You can see here we capture the funding agency and the type of organization that this organization is, the sector, the type of flow, as well as organizations that are involved in the implementation and the type of organization that those are. One of our typical, I think, lengthy project descriptions that goes through all of the details. And you can see here that this specific project is underpinned by 22 official sources that we uncovered, as well as 20 unofficial sources for some supplemental information there. And you can also see that we track the timeline of the project from commitment to implementation. So in this case, you can see that this loan agreement was signed in 2013 and implementation started quite a bit later in 2017. And we know that this project was slated for completion in 2020, but there's actually been quite a few delays in the implementation of this project, and it has not yet been completed as of when we published this data set. It extended quite substantially. I will go ahead and share back to the slides. Let me see here. So I wanted to walk you through a few facts that we uncovered from our data set, some of the, I think, big takeaways from our report that we released alongside the data set. So you can see here on the slide, some of these written out. During the first 5 years of BRI, what we found was that China outspent the US on a more than 2-to-1 basis, with average annual development finance commitments from China averaging at about 85 billion per year during that period. Here, this visual to the bottom right, you can see what this looks like in terms of commitments from the US colored in green, including ODA and OOF. And then in yellow, you can see the financing commitments from China here next to that. So you can really see, I think, the huge difference here in those first 5 years of the BRI era. China is maintaining very high levels of OOF financing, other official flows, so not categorized as ODA, official development assistance. Typically, these would be less than concessional loans or otherwise loans with mixed intent, such as export buyer's credit, which would be loans used to finance the purchase of goods or services from China, so not classifiable as ODA. And this would be to the proportion of a 9-to-1 ratio of OOF to ODA. You can also, we also have included here the typical, that the typical overseas loan from China has a 4.2% interest rate and a 10-year repayment period, compared to a typical loan from Germany or France or Japan, which has a 1.1% interest rate on average and a 28-year repayment period. So much less concessional, which kind of reflects that preference for OOF financing. We also found a tripling of mega projects during the BRI era, which would be projects which are supported by loans or export credits worth $500 million or more. So huge loans being contracted by recipient countries from China. And also an increasing proportion of loan and export credit portfolio via syndicated transactions, with the average size of syndicated loans and export credits being valued at $1.29 billion during that period, as well as a 5-fold increase in lending from Chinese state-owned commercial banks. For example, Bank of China, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, China Construction Bank during the BRI era. So for this next portion of the presentation, I will hand it off to AMMAR.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for setting this up so nicely. I will walk through a few additional insights, which I think would be interesting, and then I'll open it up to you all for questions. So one important feature that we uncover and is quite important, especially to those of us who live in the Western Hemisphere and are thinking about strategic competition between China and the US for global influence, this is this idea of the use of credit enhancements. We have found that China deploys 3 types of credit enhancements when it comes to loans. They are things like collaterals, credit insurance, or repayment guarantees. So obviously, as you know, the scale of this spending, China is going into countries which could be considered high risk, both because of the nature of the project. There is risk that they're taking on for being in countries where there's a greater risk of not getting repaid. So we pay careful attention to this. And what we found is that during the Belt and Road era, which is since 2014, the use of one of these 3 credit enhancement tools has doubled. So we used to see about 30% of the projects before Belt and Road which had one of these 3 instruments being used, but this has now gone up to about 60%. So this is reflecting the fact that China is now expanding its spending and going into more risky places where they obviously require 1 or 3 of these. So what we find in our data set is that 44% of China's overseas lending portfolio at the moment is collateralized. 17% is backed by a repayment guarantee. This could be a sovereign guarantee, or it could be a promise from a government to, let's say, buy power produced by a power plant. And 13% is backed by credit insurance policy, many of which are done by Sinosure, this one insurance provider by China, and the rates can vary depending on the risk. So you can see that all three of these tools are being used depending on the circumstances, depending on the sector, depending on the country. But obviously, collateralization has become the go-to risk mitigation tool. And this is especially the case in really large projects. So the mega projects that Catherine was talking about. And so in our data set, when we sort the projects by the loan amounts, we find that 40 out of the 50 largest loans are collateralized. And this collateralization, unlike this whole debt trap diplomacy narrative that is so popular in the media, what we are finding is that it is more likely that these collateralizations are in fact in liquid assets rather than big assets like hard assets like airports or ports, because I think they're very smart in that they're planning it in a way that they don't have to go through the court seat system or a legal system in some of these countries if they want to liquidate those assets, because an asset like a seaport or an airport is pretty much a dead asset, as opposed to what they're actually doing, which is creating these escrow accounts, which are lender-controlled bank accounts, and they are often imposing minimum cash balance requirements. Like this one example we wrote about recently, if you go to our website, you'll find a policy brief that we wrote on the Entebbe airport in Uganda, where it was very obvious that as the payments become due after the grace period is over, that the loan contract says that there will be a escrow account where all the proceeds from the airport will go, and then the creditor will deduct their payments due through that mechanism. So it's a very easy way for them to get repaid. Among borrower countries that pose high risks of high fiduciary risks, we find that the levels of collateralization are very high, about 83%. And this is obviously what explains so much of China's official sector lending that goes into countries like Angola, Turkmenistan, Guinea, Russia, Venezuela, etc. And so these tend to be resource-rich countries and so-called high-risk countries. Next slide, please. So just to go back to what Catherine was saying about concessionality, and we talked about ODA and OF, just to give you a flavor of the range of concessionality we see in our data set. So on the very left-hand side of this spectrum, you will see things like grants and technical assistance projects or debt forgiveness, where there is a 100% grant element. So it's pure aid. It's like giving like a gift. The biggest one, by the way, is in Pakistan, where they've built a $230 million airport in one of the big cities, Gwadar on the south. Strategically very important. So they deploy that in really large numbers, but in smaller contracts. On the other extreme end of this spectrum is a 0% grant element projects, where it's basically commercial like spending, where there's typically the interest rates are LIBOR, so the London interbank rate, plus a margin that accounts for the repayment risk. And in this range, we see a lot of different variations being deployed. So at around the 75% level of grant element, you will see interest-free loans, typically with 20-year repayment maturities and 10 years of grace period, so quite generous in that sense. In the middle, we find about 50% grant elements where the interest rate, these are typically loans or export credits with around 2% interest rate, 20-year maturity and 5-year grace period, and 25%, which is where the OF definition ends. We'll see a little bit higher interest rates, and maturities are slightly shorter, grace periods are slightly shorter. So you can see how there's a range of options and instruments that Chinese creditors control, and depending on the strategic importance of the asset, the country that they're working in, the time that they're working in, they can make deals which serve the needs of their own strategic objectives, but also the needs of developing countries. Next slide. So just to give you a little bit more of a flavor of how this actually works, on the left-hand side, the column talks about grants and interest-free loans from China's Ministry of Commerce. This is where technically all the aid is channeled through the Ministry of Commerce. It's a little bit more centralized, and it seems that it is more directly tied to the government's strategic objectives. MOFCOM also puts out strategic white papers now, so you can try to connect the dots and understand, what's what. It's very interesting when we look at the breakdown of these projects. You see that grants and interest-free loans seem to be catering to the so-called elites in developing countries. So things like presidential palaces or stadiums or opera houses or art centers and hospitals, museums in large cities, they tend to be given as more like public diplomacy initiatives, which helps buy the goodwill of the people who run those countries. On the right-hand side, when you look at mostly non-concessional loans from China Development Bank and the state-owned commercial banks, here you see much more likely commercial-oriented projects which have greater chances of getting repayments. So here we're thinking of extractive industries like oil refineries and gas pipelines, but also things like toll roads, mines, and sometimes even industrial parks or special economic zones. So you see that there is, like, again, a range of instruments that are being deployed, a range of projects that are being implemented. And of course, in the middle, there are more concessional or semi-concessional loans, mostly from China Exim Bank, which is a policy bank. Here, they tend to fund more public infrastructure, things like highways and power plants, electricity transmission lines. But the thing that is distinctive about Chinese development financing overall, if you look at the whole picture, is that it is incredibly demand responsive. It is often the case that developing country presidents and prime ministers are themselves asked to sign off on the requests that are put forward to the Chinese side. In many countries, the NDRC, which is a big planning agency in China, they are the ones who kind of coordinate all this on the Chinese side, but there seems to be a very strong focus on providing what developing countries are needing. Almost, you can think of this as like a menu that you get at a restaurant. So if a country is looking for energy projects, there is going to be 5 options from solar to wind to coal power, and there's different price tags and different kinds of terms and conditions, different kinds of consortiums that are available. So you can choose whichever you want. The Chinese side will not come with any strings attached or any preconditions in the way that perhaps some of these countries are getting from other donors. Next slide. Again, in terms of, if you think of where Chinese development financing is going, first of all, I would like to invite you to check out the interactive map we've put on our website. So aiddata.org/China-development-finance, where you can go and zoom in and out. I'll start with giving you a sense of the top 10 recipients of ODA, which is, again, more like aid. They are countries which are diplomatically important for Chinese foreign policy or strategic interests. Places like Iraq and North Korea and Ethiopia feature very highly. Pakistan is number 6, but also Bangladesh and Myanmar. These are all countries which are so-called in sort of the sphere of influence, or China wants to use these grants to help build good relations with. As far as the debt is concerned, that is big countries like Russia and Venezuela and Angola, which are also, it's not a coincidence that the extractive industry is very big in these countries, and they are much more likely to have mineral assets that they can extract. And again, countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh appear to be on both lists. Pakistan and Indonesia appear to be on both lists because they are really big recipients of Chinese overseas finance. To put this in context, if you look at aid or ODA, 80% goes to Africa and Asia. So that seems to be a very strong preference. If you look at the map here, you can see there's more colors in Africa. Chinese OOF is, however, more evenly spread across 4 regions. I would say about a quarter of it goes to Asia, quarter goes to the Americas region, essentially mostly Latin America, Europe, and Africa. So it's more evenly spread out. ODA tends to be more consistently RMB denominated. I think Catherine alluded to that a little bit. More grants and interest-free loans. Whereas OOF tends to be more dollar and euro denominated loans and export credits that are priced closer to market rates, as I was saying earlier. And of course, because of that, the Chinese OOF tends to be more in bankable projects. And I think this is also an insight into how China is thinking about this. And I'll come to that in a minute. But Catherine, maybe you can move to the next slide here. So if you think of on the Chinese side, what we think of our motivations for providing ODA and motivations for providing OOF, they kind of vary, and it's a mix. So ODA tends to be, as I said, if you look at those country, ODA tends to be in deployed strategically to help win influence in the UN General Assembly and the Security Council on important issues. So we find in one of the papers that I'm citing here, our colleagues Brad Parks and Axel Andreas and others have written, find that a 10% increase is seen in UN General Assembly voting, which leads a 86% increase in Chinese aid on average. So there's a very clear relationship where China ramps up their spending in a certain country, the voting patterns seem to be shifting. Countries which are more in line with China's position on Taiwan or One China policy are more likely to be on the ODA side. And then similarly, we find that ODA is also deployed in countries where China is struggling with public opinion or wants to enhance their image because of the nature of these projects. Whereas when you think of OOF, as I said, there's a lot of foreign currency denominated loans that are being given out. I think primarily the motivations are domestic, where as you think of in a very simple model, China is exporting a lot around the world, earning a lot of dollars and euros. And because US Treasury rates since the 2008-2009 financial crisis are so low, in terms of getting returns, a lot of this money is not parked in US Treasuries anymore. So they are much more likely to get better returns, higher returns by putting this money to loans of this nature. So they are solving a domestic excess supply of foreign currency problem by enhancing their overseas activities. It's also being used more for natural resource reasons, which is again a strategic reasons. This is why you see a country like Angola to be so high on the list of OOF countries. And of course, it also is commercially oriented because a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises, they have a lot of capacity for construction work. They have built out highways and bridges and tunnels at home, and now they have excess capacity. So China is also using it to give them an entry point into some of these markets by also financing them and working with government. So they're serving a lot of these different purposes for these different instruments. Catherine, next slide. A few other things I will leave you with is this idea of hidden debt. When we released the report, one of the first things that struck the imagination of all the journalists in the BBC and New York Times and others was this idea of hidden debt. You know, here the first thing that I want you to know is that we find that 42 countries in our data set owe amounts of money to China, which are more than 10% of their GDP. And then the other thing we find is that because often Chinese projects are funded through special purpose vehicles or joint ventures, a lot of this debt is not booked under public debt and therefore not reported as much to the World Bank's debtor reporting system. The World Bank's debtor reporting system is an official system that has been put in place for all member states for the last 50, 60 years. And what we find is that there is a pretty large gap between what is reported as public debt to the World Bank and what is actually public debt that we find in our data. The reason is that a lot of public infrastructure like energy projects and highways are being funded through special purpose vehicles or joint ventures between Chinese entities and local state-owned enterprises. But the assumption that we are making in this is that when push comes to shove, when these projects are not successful, when there is a bailout needed, that the states will step in and and rescued some of these projects. This happened in the case of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, where the Indonesian president had repeatedly said that this will be a private sector project. It's investment that is being through the private channel, and the Indonesian government will never be responsible for it. But when the project got delayed, and because it was a public infrastructure asset, the Indonesian government had to step in and essentially bail out the project. So this is why this idea of public and private debt getting mixed up is so important, because the true extent of this debt problem, I think, needs to be exposed. And this is where some of our data could be helpful. Next slide, Catherine. Enrique, you had given us 45 minutes, and I promise I'll stop at the 45-minute mark. So a couple more things I wanted to highlight. Thank you. So as Catherine mentioned, if you remember, we have a lot of descriptive data, also words that we have captured in the descriptions because of all the sources and writing the summaries of the projects. What we do then is we run searches, word searches in that 2 million word repository of information. And what we find is that about 35% of Belt and Road projects have encountered some sort of an implementation problem according to our data. So it would be something like, sometimes you see corruption scandals or stories of corruption scandals coming out, labor violations, environmental hazards, and public protests. So these kinds of things are happening quite frequently. And host country policymakers, we feel in certain countries especially, are beginning to criticize high-profile Chinese infrastructure projects because of overpricing concerns, because of corruption and other things. So I think in some places, at least, China is going to face a public relations challenge in managing the relationship with those countries. We are finding also in 2 to 3 dozen countries some evidence of buyers, what we call buyer's remorse. And we say this because we are finding that the public opinion polls coming out of these countries are showing that the positivity rankings or the positivity scores in the public for China are going down. And when we see this kind of a turn happening, we think that that is an indication of buyer's remorse. And a lot of times we get asked by our colleagues in Brussels and in Washington and London, what should we do about this increase from China's side and their growing global influence. And I think that it is important for them to look carefully for windows of opportunities where this kind of a problem or scandal arises, to try to explain to developing countries why their approach of having more safeguards for environmental issues, for more protections for human rights, more protection for labor, why is that important, and what makes those projects more likely to succeed and be more sustainable. I remember President Biden, made a speech at the UN last year in September in which he made the case for the US Build Back Better World initiative, and in which one of the things he said was that if you protect the environment, if you worry about labor violations, human rights in doing infrastructure projects, then those projects are more likely to be successful. But I think a lot of countries in the developing world are asking for proof of that. And I think that when these kinds of buyer's remorse incidents take place, I think that's an opportunity for a demonstration of why having those protections was important in the first place. So, and of course, the Sri Lanka case is a case in point as well. So I'll stop here and look forward to your questions, your reactions, and your engagement. So thank you very much. And I would once again invite all of you to go to our website, aiddata.org, and search through some of the sources that we've talked about. We have a number of policy briefs and reports, and our data set is also available. The documentation is also freely available for anybody to download. And I would invite you all to dig into the data and work or do your research using some of the data that we are putting out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ammar and Catherine, for your interesting presentation and for your time. While we start receiving some questions, just some brief comments from my part. No, I would simply like to encourage the audience to use the data sets. I have done it by myself too, and I think it's a great opportunity to deepen many different topics we are working on. I could imagine many topics. Loans by Chinese institutions, differences before 2013 and after, or 14 if you wish, and before and after 2014. Is there a qualitative difference in loans by China? And particularly relevant, based also on the work we're doing, is the topic of loans by goal, to put it somehow, which means the issue of infrastructure projects or other issues. You mentioned these other official flows and ODA. The other official flows account for around 90%. So probably this would be an important topic or part to deepen. But again, I could imagine many different issues. Ammar and Catherine, 2 or 3 questions from my side, again, before we get some additional questions and topics. If I understand correctly, loans and this financing includes then, of course, infrastructure projects, ODA, but do you, I guess you do also include loans and grants for trade, right? If you mention that Venezuela had, I didn't write down the number, but huge amounts of loans by from China. In the case of Venezuela, it's mainly for export-import transactions, mainly imports. So if you could simply briefly clarify what kind of transactions are behind the loans, this would be very useful. And then a second question would be, if you could, Catherine, briefly mention this, we do this ourselves for overseas foreign direct investment and infrastructure projects. How do you compile? How do this 13,427 projects? We do this only for Latin America. And if you tell us that there are 90,000 plus sources, well, Ammar is probably a source, Catherine is a source, I am a source, etc. I'm joking. It's a lot of work, very difficult. There are lots of official sources. And still, you mentioned the case of Costa Rica. We have been working on that case. It's probably a good case to see how some of these loans and infrastructure projects are not working. But if you could deepen a little bit, I don't want to get into the details. And the final topic, and probably more for Ammar, regarding, again, there are no good and bad sources and institutions compiling this kind of information. But Ammar, have you started, otherwise we could do this together in the future, have you started comparing some of the results from CGIT, from the Global Investment, China Global Investment Tracker, but also the data provided by Boston University and Kevin Gallagher and Rebecca Ray? We're all good friends. We participate in many issues. And again, there are not good or bad data sources, but again, for third parties like our audience, what have you started doing some differences and to see why these differences exist, etc.? Otherwise, again, at an individual basis, everybody comes up with different results, which is a pity in most of the cases. 3 questions. Maybe you wish to start with this, and then we are already getting some additional questions. And maybe we can do, I don't know, 2 or maybe 3 rounds of questions, if that is okay with you, AMMAR and Catherine.
Yeah, that sounds good. I actually should invite Catherine to explain a little bit of the process. I think it's an important question, and Catherine is the largely responsible for making as much of this magic happen. So Catherine, why don't you walk us through how we do this and explain a little bit about the sources that Enrique was talking about?
Yeah, it's actually quite a complex process that we go through. So I'll explain it quite in brief. There are many stages to our data collection process, and at the initial stage, our staff members compile a list of many different sources of information from the donor country government, China, as well as recipient country governments that are likely to contain information on these types of Chinese financing activities to the recipient country. We have our student research assistants, usually from the College of William and Mary, but we also employ students from other universities as well, will then systematically review all of these sources to update the coverage that we have from a variety of different source reporting from the donor and recipient government. And at that point, we also consult with other databases available, like the Boston University Dataset as well. We'll check to make sure that we have coverage of any loans that they've identified at that stage. After we review these official sources, we then have a pretty comprehensive search phrase that we use for a database that archives media sources, where we target articles that may have been published related to Chinese financing activities to each recipient country that we track. And our research assistants will review those search results and identify any project level information from there as well. So at that point, we have quite a huge picture of Chinese financing for these commitment years once we scrape those sources. After which, we then have our second stage of the data collection process, where we then review all of these project entries again that we've created, and we conduct targeted searches to fill in any information gaps, and also to target things like loan contracts that we may have potentially missed, and other sorts of details related to the financial and physical status of the project, such as project implementation as well. And then from there, we have our quality assurance. We conduct a systematic review to check for any holes in the data. And yeah, it's quite a lengthy process, and it's really made possible by our team of research assistants, I would say, that we've been able to work with throughout the years, and it's just a continuous effort there. I think I'll also speak to the question that you posed about the loans and grants, for example, for projects related to trade, like exports and imports. What we capture in our data set is any type of project that would fit the criteria for being classified as official finance. So falling into kind of the categorization of ODA or OOF. So this would include all different sorts of loans and grants. And we do see quite a lot that support like investment projects. And we see a huge amount of loans to companies, and for providing like export buyers credits to support the purchase of goods or services from China to support the implementation of many of these different projects. Yeah, I'll hand it over, I think, to AMMAR at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And to your last point, Enrique, when you were talking about comparing results, I put this in the chat, but when I first joined this team about a year ago, this was one of my first questions, because I actually was a lecturer at BU, not working with Kevin's group, but just knowing about them. And basically, we put together a table. Actually, Catherine put together that table comparing all the different data sets that do tracking of Chinese development finance. And of course, BU and SciScary and others were part of that. And I think I wrote this in my chat just now also, but what the main difference is that AidData has a very broad coverage. We cover essentially all the sectors, all financial institutions, financing institutions, and all regions of the world, whereas most of the other data sets are a little bit more specialized. So there's an energy tracker and others. We also have a lot more focus on longer, more detailed, denser descriptions like Catherine showed, whereas most of the other data sets will give shorter descriptions. We also take a lot of effort in putting the geo-coordinates, exact geo-coordinates of the projects, where we used to do, just identify the district in which a project was existing, to now a system where our teams are using satellite imagery to try to literally draw. If it says there's a power plant, we will draw the boundaries of the power plant and then go back and review it and expand it if the power plant has changed. So, and then also we have become more temporally precise, which means, as Catherine said, the exact date on when the project was should have been completed versus when it was actually completed is an important piece of information. So when we become more spatially and temporally focused, I think it opens more analysis opportunities for those of us who are researchers. But the truth is that we are also constantly consulting with Kevin's data sets and Saiskari's data sets, and I'm sure they use ours for their purposes. So I think we should use all available data sources, but just take the time as researchers to understand what's what. And one thing that I would also say is we do a lot of this detail of the methodology that Catherine was talking about is very well documented in a 90-page methodology document on our website. So I think if people have questions about trying to understand what's what, I think they can also refer to that as well. But I think generally we are all on the same page about the need to improve transparency and to have more data out there and available for good research to take place, regardless of who puts it out. And yeah, I think I'll stop here, and we can, I'm sure there's other questions trickling in as well that you want to bring.
Look, there are two related questions. You kindly responded to them through the chat. However, it would be interesting and important, AMMAR and Catherine, if you could maybe briefly refer to them, thinking that we have the audio and the video. Usually the chat is being lost in this process, no? So
yeah,
just for the future, it would be important to make a reference to the enormous richness of your data set by country. You already responded to that. Maybe you can briefly get back to that, no?
Yes, I certainly hope so. Maybe I can say that for the comparison of the different data sources, it is table A-1 on page 95 of our report, where you can find a lot of this. And if you want to go into country by country summary of the data in PDF format, if you go to the appendix section of our report and search for hidden debt or sovereign debt, you will find country by country analysis on the debt numbers that I think people might find useful. So just for the record, saying it in case somebody's listening to it in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. And by the way, have you, as AidData, started doing some regional analysis, for example, on Latin America, based on your data, or other regions in the world, or not yet?
No, not yet, but it is certainly something that we want to expand on. And we are a small team, and we're very busy with managing all this data collection effort. So in fact, we would very much like to collaborate with you all, and we are hoping that by putting everything that we do on the public sphere, that there will be other colleagues who take this on and move it forward. And we want to help build a network of those of us who are interested in topics. So we would very much like to engage and collaborate. And if there are folks who in this room today who would like to talk about that, we are very, very excited about it. We put our email addresses in the last slide. So please get in touch with us, and we would very much like to do I think there's much to do on regions, country level, and looking at, when Belt and Road started, when it didn't start, what was happening at a given time in a given country. Yep, so definitely open to that.
And Ammar and Catherine, there is a last question. You have been probably faced with this before by Rhys Jenkins, an old friend and colleague working on these issues. Simply asking if you have any kind of classification of projects according to whether they were initiated as formally part of BRI or not. Latin America formally has become part of BRI since January of 2018. How do you deal with this question of being part or not of BRI? No?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and one that actually another team within AidData, led by Samantha Custer and colleagues, they are doing a specific exercise right now as we speak, where they're going into our data set, trying to look at the definitions of the 5 or 6 connectivities that the original concept of Belt and Road came when President Xi made those 2 famous speeches in 2013 and 2014. And they're going through the data and doing a tagging exercise to say what's BRI, what's not BRI. We use, loosely speaking, BRI era and in the global context, but this is one of the areas where when we go deeper into a region or a country, I think understanding what's BRI, what's not BRI it becomes much more relevant, much more important. We use BRI era referring to 2013, 2014 and later years. And our data set actually, at the moment, the public version only covers commitment years until 2017. 2018, 19, 20, we are still working on that, and we hope to release that next year. So you will get the more detailed analysis. So we generally use the term Chinese development finance more broadly, because we are also seeing that BRI is more of a banner, an ecosystem, a concept almost, within which a lot of projects are being, as they say in English, grandfathered into that, which is what Samantha Custer and the team is now looking at. So in my own hometown of Lahore in Pakistan, we always had this master plan for constructing a mass transit line, like a underground and overground mass transit line. And that got also included in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is BRI. And a lot of people still ask this question, wait, why, what does this have to do with the concept of the BRI, which is about trade facilitation, it's about international connectivity. And a lot of people still think that they've just thrown that into the BRI, but actually it's not BRI. So I think this is a very important question, but my sense is that we should not get hung up more on like, what is BRI, what's not BRI, because I think it's an umbrella, it's a concept. And a lot of these things are fluid, and we should give ourselves that margin. Catherine?
Yeah, I would also add that in our report, we do include in the appendix, table A-17, which lists the year that countries first signed the BRI cooperative agreement or MOU. And we did incorporate in our analysis projects that were officially implemented as part of BRI based on the signing year of a cooperative agreement or MOU.
Okay, very interesting. Congratulations, Ammar, Catherine, on your incredible work. We know what it means, and so I'm not pushing, simply asking if you have done regional or country level work. If you want to include more updated information, I know that it means a lot of work. We're just this month, we're publishing our report on China's OFDI in Latin America. And again, it's a smaller region, but still lots of work. And then later the monitor on Chinese infrastructure. I can promise you that we will intensively use the data set you are kindly offering. And I can also promise you, Ammar and Catherine, that if you are willing, we would be very happy personally and institutionally, very happy to engage in this dialogue. We are more interested in Latin America, no? And we can provide you there with some insights on specific projects based on the network of researchers and students that we have. No? I will get back to you on this issue. No? But
absolutely.
Thank you very much for your time and congratulations for your huge support and effort, and congratulations with your idea, which means a lot of work, trying to update this as soon as possible. Oh.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Enrique. I really appreciate all of you and your time and doing this. It was a pleasure, and I hope to stay in touch and use this first meeting as a starting point for a broader engagement with your network. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Bye.
Thank you, AMMAR. Have a good day. Yeah. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
To everybody.